It is 9 p.m. here in the United States. I'm Ben Swann. Here are the stories we're following at this hour. The Iran war takes another turn. New strikes, new players, and new questions about America's next move. Plus, the war in Ukraine taking another dangerous turn. Russia says hundreds of Ukrainian drones were launched overnight, including an attack near a nuclear facility.
I would like to apologize on your show to the people of Ukraine for some of the things that I've said about your country.
And finally, why is Ukraine rolling out the red carpet for a Trump ally who once called the country a Nazi state? On this show, we know you don't need more content, but you do need context. Anyone can tell you what's happening in the news. Tonight, we hope to help you understand why it's happening, how it affects you. This is America Now. Well, as we get rolling tonight, we have to ask a very simple question. Is there actually a strategy in this war in Iran? Because the headlines keep changing, right? The targets keep changing. The countries involved keep changing. But the endgame, well, that remains completely unclear. See, here's the latest. Today, Iran claimed that it retaliated against the United States, announcing strikes on a military base in Kuwait after what it says was a major U.S. airstrike on Qeshm Island earlier in the day. The IRGC claims the U.S. strike hit residential homes, killing a family of 3, including 1 child. Iran also claims that it targeted a U.S. base in Jordan, and it says it destroyed 3 American F-35 fighter jets. Those claims have not been verified, and CENTCOM says it's not true. But what we do know at this hour is that the conflict is spreading, because look at this. German and French aircraft are now patrolling the skies over Jordan to help protect Western military positions. Saudi Arabia has expanded its strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. Each day, another country, another front, another step toward a much larger war. And here at home, the reports coming out of Washington are not providing much reassurance.
The president has been presented an option by the head of CENTCOM to go big and escalate strikes. According to the Wall Street Journal, the idea behind Admiral Brad Cooper's high-end option is to go beyond the smaller retaliatory airstrikes that have done little to deter Tehran from threatening ships in the Strait of Hormuz and lobbing missiles at American forces in the region by sharply escalating the war, according to people familiar with his thinking.
So according to the reporting there, President Trump has been presented with a military option to significantly expand U.S. strikes against Iran. How far are we talking? Again, it's unclear. But the fact that those options are now on the table should get your attention. Because inside the administration, there does not appear to be agreement on what happens next. See, for months, we have heard reports indicating that Secretary of War Pete Hegseth is pushing for a more aggressive military approach, including the possibility of ground troops. Listen to him in March.
As far as President Trump and boots on the ground, I don't understand why the base, which they have already, they understand, wouldn't have faith in his ability to execute on this. Look at his track record of pursuing peace through strength, America first outcomes. What he's simply saying, and it's exactly true, and I've said from this podium too, we're not going to foreclose any option. You can't fight and win a war if you tell your adversary what you are willing to do or what you are not willing to do, to include boots on the ground.
Yeah, and that's not it. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, he reportedly supports continued military pressure, but without committing American ground forces. And finally, Vice President J.D. Vance is said to be arguing for a negotiated exit, so much so that it caused a public rift between him and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, here's how Netanyahu responded to comments made by Vance on the Joe Rogan show earlier this month.
Vice President J.D. Vance recently told Joe Rogan that Israel is attempting to undermine the end to the war in Iran. And I want to quote him. He said that people in your system are manipulating and trying to change American public opinion to keep the war going on. How do you respond to that?
Well, we're not, actually. And I had a very good conversation with the vice president this morning. And I think we straightened that out, because we're not. That's not our policy. Individuals in our system can have their opinions, but government policy is dictated by me, and that's not our policy.
Yeah, you heard it there. That's not their policy, right? Kind of hard to believe. Regardless, right now, there are 3 senior officials, look, who all have very different visions about where this war goes. And that may explain why the messaging and the strategy, or the lack thereof, seems to change almost daily. One day we hear about diplomacy. The next day it's more airstrikes. Now reports of even bigger military options. It depends on who had the president's ear last. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that President Trump became so frustrated recently during a national security meeting that he shouted, he cursed, and he exploded over the lack of progress, not just with Iran, but with the military options being presented to him. According to the report, one U.S. official said after all this time, there is no unity, adding that the administration is facing a strategic defeat without clear policy guidance or a decision about where this is going. I think that is very true. Another report described the president as exasperated, saying that there is no real strategy for how long or what they should do. Think about this. That is reportedly the words of people inside the administration. It's a huge problem because wars have a way of making decisions for you when you do not make them for yourself. The question is, will our lawmakers realize that before it's too late? Joining us now to discuss is Dave Decamp. Dave is the news editor at antiwar.com. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So, I tend to believe what I'm reading here about this back and forth because it makes a lot of sense that you have various different views, various positions taken by different people within the administration because, as we said, from one day to the next, everything changes, right? We go from we're going to get a negotiated peace. We're going to give Iran more time. We're going to destroy them. We're going to, blow them to pieces. And because it changes on a daily basis, there clearly is nobody who is giving any kind of cohesive plan here.
Yeah, and this has been a very difficult conflict to follow because, as you said, one day, we see President Trump threatening to escalate, take Karg Island, and then later that night he might announce that there's some kind of deal has been reached. And it does not seem to be very coordinated. And there really seems to be no exit at the moment for President Trump. He doesn't seem to be willing to do what would be necessary to actually reach a diplomatic deal with Iran. He also appears to realize that he's kind of out of military options. I mean, the only options that he really has is to just blow more things up and kill more people inside Iran, just by escalating airstrikes. But there's no sign that that would achieve anything, get the Strait of Hormuz open. But I think one clear pattern that we are seeing right now is some of the stuff you were going over there in the beginning is the escalations of other parties getting involved, the escalations in Yemen. We just saw the U.S. and Saudi Arabia launch major airstrikes in Iraq and kill dozens of PMF fighters. They're the Shia militias that are aligned with Iran. That group was actually formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. So they were once an ally of the U.S. But we're just seeing this pattern. And I think what the U.S. wants right now is to get more other countries involved, so this doesn't turn into just, the U.S. and Iran striking back and forth. I think when they're running out of these military options, and it looks like they do still want to keep this conflict going at some point, that they want it to turn more into a regional conflict. And this is something that Israel wants to see, is this division between, the Gulf Arab states and Iran and its Shia allies. And that just seems to be the direction everything is heading.
Well, the problem, I think, for all those Gulf allies and those Gulf countries is that they cannot afford to get heavily involved because they are within the range to have their desalination plants destroyed, their oil infrastructure destroyed, their airports destroyed. It's too dangerous for them. And so it's almost as if the U.S. says, well, we'll continue bombing because we're far enough away that we're not afraid of being hit. But we have to do it in a way so that it doesn't create retaliation, which also greatly limits the targets you can hit. Trump talks a lot about wanting to hit all the power plants, and he wants to destroy the desalination plants across Iran. The problem is that that's a tit-for-tat attack. The Iranians can play that game all day long if they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think that is what has stopped him up to this point. We've seen him countless times make that threat. Yeah. And there's a few times that it seemed kind of imminent, like he was going to take that step. But I think Iran's ability, we've seen some limited U.S. attacks on bridges, power plants inside Iran throughout this war. And then Iran would usually hit back at one or two facilities, infrastructure in the Gulf Arab states. And it's a good point that you make, that these countries have a lot to lose in this war. But I think that's why we've seen, if you've been following this news with Saudi Arabia, they've gotten a new nuclear deal from the U.S. That is something that the Saudis, that the Crown Prince has wanted for a long time. And kind of, it seemed sudden that they signed this deal. And we've seen new U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia move forward. And President Trump essentially gave his blessing for them to restart the war against the Houthis in Yemen, something that they would not do without U.S. support, which they need to maintain their air force and get intelligence for this war. So I think they're trying to dangle some things in front of these Gulf countries to get them to kind of go along with these escalations.
One of the things that we keep reporting on, and it's so hard every day, right? Because CENTCOM puts out a whole set of information. IRGC puts out a whole set of information, many times conflicting with each other. We don't know who's lying from one day to the next. It's very hard to get information out of the region. But I think there are signs, right? Maybe we don't know for sure, but there are signs. And one sign that U.S. interceptor missiles have been greatly depleted is the fact that you now have as we mentioned, French and German jets flying over Jordan to try to knock down missiles because your interceptors are gone. And that is, I think, such an important point moving forward, because if the U.S. does not have the ability to knock down these missiles or has run dry on them, Iran war aside, you ran dry in less than 6 months. I think that exposes kind of what a mess our strategy has been, a mess that the military-industrial complex has put us in by selling so few weapons to us at such enormously inflated prices. I think the whole thing looks like a house of cards that's falling down in real time.
Yeah, and I think it's a potential silver lining moving forward on all of this, that a lot of this has been exposed. What does this $1 trillion a year budget actually get us if they can't sustain a war for this long? And can the U.S. even think about defending Taiwan from a Chinese attack if it cannot keep up this war with Iran? But on the other hand, what we're seeing now is, Pete Hegseth is looking for that $1.5 trillion budget for next year. Just today, there's news that Lockheed Martin got a big $58 billion contract to replenish the Patriot missiles. So we see the military-industrial complex kind of being revitalized a bit by this war. Though, I mean, how long can this go on? How sustainable, is this whole system?
Well, and even when you get those big contracts to replenish Patriot missiles, how long does it take in the assembly line to get them out? And how few are we actually getting? Because again, we see that I believe the majority of that, 80% of that Patriot missile supply has been depleted again in a 5-6 month long war. It's pretty incredible. And I think the drone warfare leans into that, because you can send a lot of cheap drones to cause you to expend all of your defensive missile capabilities. And now you're kind of a sitting duck at that point. It seems like that's what we've been seeing. I'll give you the last word here, but I think at this point, Dave, the biggest issue that we're facing is that this administration has got to figure out what the strategy is. I heard today that one of the problems is they can't even agree on what the goal of the war is, whether it's to deny Iran a nuclear weapon, whether it's to degrade their military and their missile defenses, whether it's regime change. When the administration can't even agree on what the outcome should be, it completely eliminates the ability to have an exit strategy. Again, last word here.
Yeah, and that has been the pattern of this war even since it started. They were all over the place about their goals. They would say regime change. President Trump essentially said regime change, and then you'd see other officials say, "Oh no, that's what Israel wants. That's not our goal." They've tried to separate themselves a bit from Israel's goals, but I think it's clear that one party in this conflict, which is Israel, is getting what they want at the moment. They want the U.S. to keep hitting Iran, and they're currently sitting out of the war. They're not facing the Iranian missile attacks. So I think from Netanyahu's perspective, this is kind of the best case scenario for him right now, but certainly not for the U.S. or Americans in any way.
Certainly not. Dave Decamp, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. Over now to Europe. Russian air defenses reportedly shot down 258 Ukrainian drones across multiple areas just overnight. RT correspondent Roman Kosarev brings us more.
Now, once again, as we have reported so many times before, due to a complete lack of success on the battlefield, the Kiev regime resorts to pure terrorist acts against civilians and civilian infrastructure. One person was killed in the Udmurtia Republic in central Russia after a few drones were downed in that area. Another 4 people were wounded in Penza region after Ukraine drones struck a warehouse belonging belonging to an e-commerce marketplace giant called Wildberries. Now, this is not the first such attack against this particular company's warehouses that mainly deals with home care and beauty products. Now, according to the Penza region governor, the military of the Kiev regime are following in the footsteps of their idols, Nazi Germany, by attacking unsuspecting civilians.
The warehouse that was attacked is a civilian infrastructure facility. The attack on it and on civilians, workers of the enterprise, among whom, by the way, are many women and representatives of our youth, is yet more evidence of the aggressive, fascist nature of the Kiev regime and its accomplices. This is a clear manifestation of the fact that the Kiev scumbags show no regard for anything. On the battlefield, the Ukro-fascists are suffering defeat with each passing day. Our army is constantly advancing. They cannot stand up to our boys. Therefore, they have chosen tactics of terror against the civilian population, following the example of their idols, the Hitlerites.
Meanwhile, the Russian troops continue to advance on all areas of the special military operation. The Defense Ministry reported that the Russian troops liberated the Krasnoyarsk settlement in Donetsk People's Republic, right where we are, and also extended a safety buffer zone in Kharkov and Sumy regions by liberating settlements of Yurchenkova, Mogritsa, and Malaya Slobodka, respectively. Meanwhile, overnight, Russia's latest massive strikes with high-precision, long-range land, air, and sea-based weapons, as well as drones, also reached Ukrainian military airfields, enterprises of the military-industrial complex, military telecommunications, and logistics centers. Now, according to the Defense Ministry, the geography of the strikes covered the cities of Kiev, Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, Zhytomyr, as well as Rovno, Vinnytsia, and Dnepropetrovsk regions. The targets included sites that are involved in the production, storage, delivery of missiles and drones, as well as ensuring the operation of air control systems. Now, according to reports from Ukraine, the military of the Kiev regime were only able to shoot down 1 of 9 Russian ballistic missiles over the Ukrainian capital, while earlier Zelensky complained that it was impossible to shoot down a significant number of Russian missiles. Now, as for the details of the massive overnight strikes, Russia basically dismantled a weapons conveyor in different regions of Ukraine. In the western Ukrainian city of Lvov, an aircraft factory was hit, which produces and repairs engines for the Firepoint 5 Flamingo. Now, also there, a factory called Lorta, which produces onboard electronics for missiles and systems for the Neptune MD. That one was attacked as well. And staying in western Ukraine, where in the Ivano-Frankivsk region, a company involved in the production of ground-based Flamingo cruise missiles was also hit. Over in the Ukrainian capital, an artillery and small arms factory that produced launch boosters for the FP-1 and 2 strike drones was also hit. Over in the Rovno region, a chemical plant called Rovno Azot that produces components for FP-5 Flamingo missiles was also struck. And over in the Dnepropetrovsk region, a turbofan plant called Aquaplast that assembles drones and unmanned boats was also targeted as well. Strikes also continued against Ukraine's Black Sea ports and ships that are used in the interest of the Ukrainian military. A cargo vessel was struck in the Yuzhny port, and 2 other cargo ships were hit east and south of Odessa that were delivering weapons and military equipment.
Well, meanwhile, losing ground on the battlefield, Kiev is seeking new ways to rebuild its image. In this case, by recruiting influencers. And one of those influencers is Laura Loomer, who recently took a trip to Ukraine and interviewed Volodymyr Zelensky. She is now calling for more funding for Kiev and says Ukraine does not have a neo-Nazi problem. RT's Farida Singatalina has more.
Well, it's quite a remarkable turnaround. Laura Loomer spent years fiercely opposing the Kiev regime. She wrote opinion pieces about this even for RT, and on numerous occasions quoted Russian officials. She at some stage even said that Ukraine was a country, quote, full of Nazi apologists, and also accused Kiev's leadership of supporting extremists. But right now, she's traveled to Kyiv and even sat down with Vladimir Zelensky for an interview where he states there are no neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Let's take a listen.
There are no Nazism in Ukraine and never was. So we have hundreds of minorities, different people, Jewish minorities.
So he says, surprise, surprise, there are no neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And yet, Laura Loomer also decides to sit down for an interview with a member of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion.
In the frontline city of Kharkiv, Ukraine, I just met with the renowned General Andriy Beletsky, founder of the Azov Battalion and commander of the 3rd Army Corps in Ukraine. Is it true or false that Azov Battalion and the Ukrainian army are full of swastika-waving neo-Nazis? Are our tax dollars funding an army of Nazis to fight the Russians? I asked the general and founder of Azov himself. No questions were off limits.
And guess what? He's not only a member of the Azov Battalion. Andrei Beletsky is the founder of the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion and sparked quite some controversy in 2024 when he decided to award a man who took a photograph of himself at Auschwitz wearing a T-shirt with a quote on it attributed to Adolf Hitler. And yet, after all of this, she still decides to say that there are no neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So let's take a look at a series of other incidents that happened over the years. So in 2023 in Canada's Parliament, Vladimir Zelensky, along with other members of Parliament and leaders, decided to applaud a man called Yaroslav Hunka, who later turned out to be a Ukrainian veteran who served in a Nazi SS unit during the Second World War. Another example is the fact that critics on multiple occasions have brought up Vladimir Zelensky being photographed with Ukrainian soldiers, awarding them at ceremonies whilst they're wearing patches with far-right extremist symbols. And not to mention the annual parades that Ukraine holds honoring nationalist leader Stepan Bandera for his birthday. So despite all of these examples and all of this evidence, when asked about the Azov Battalion and its neo-Nazi links, Vladimir Zelensky simply says they are what they are. Let's take a listen.
I want to have you clear something up for us. And this is these reports about the Azov Battalion that is said to be Nazi-affiliated organization operating as a militia in your country, said to be committing their own atrocities. What should Americans know about that unit, about those reports?
So Azov was one of those many battalions. They are what they are.
So he's refused to acknowledge anything they've done, he's refused to condemn anything they've done, and simply decided to brush everything under the carpet. Well, what's interesting is, in recent years, Poland has been criticizing Ukraine more and more for honoring controversial nationalist figures during the Second World War. Most recently, in May of 2026, Vladimir Zelensky decided to hold a ceremony and honor and rebury Andrei Melnik, who was a leader of a faction for the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Now, many critics have stated that people from his movement were openly linked to Nazis and openly collaborated with Nazis during the Second World War. Well, because of this, Karol Nawrocki accused Kyiv of crossing a red line and said that as well as this, but also because Kyiv decided to rename a military group after a military unit that massacred Poles and Jews and Russians during the Second World War. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The decision of the Ukrainian authorities to glorify the UPA is not only outrageous, it is also incomprehensible and deeply disappointing. We cannot allow the promotion of ideologies responsible for genocide. There is no place in Polish public space for the red and black Bandera flags.
And what about the historical context? Well, this all goes back to the Second World War. Specifically, an important part of it was the Volhynia massacre, where members of the Ukrainian insurgent army massacred tens of thousands of peaceful Polish civilians. Now, it's still a touchy subject and affects the relationship between Poland and Ukraine today. Most recently, critics highlighted the fact that Vladimir Zelensky decided to award the title Hero of Ukraine to former Ukrainian insurgent army commander Myroslav Simchich, who openly collaborated with Nazis, and the FSB has recently revealed documents where it stated that Simchich attacked and ordered the killings of many civilians. Now, Russia says the newly released documents identify Myroslav Simchich as a former commander in the Ukrainian insurgent army who was involved in attacks on civilians in western Ukraine. According to these documents, there was a case from October of 1944 where 77 people were brutally killed, 20 of them children. Let's take a look at another case from November of 1944.
It was established that on 8 of November 1944, Simchich led an attack by a bandit squad on the village of Pistin in the Kosov district of the Ivano-Frankovsk region, during which, on his orders and instructions, the bandits killed 19 residents of Polish nationality, women, old people and children, and also burned 61 private households, the village council building, a telephone exchange, a church and an 80-metre-long bridge across the Pistenka River.
Well, Ukraine, however, views many of these figures as fighters for independence. Let's take a look at another case that really stood out and is considered as one of the most disturbing cases, where it describes in the documents a case of a woman who was brutally mutilated by soldiers of the Ukrainian insurgent army. She had her breasts cut off, her ears cut off, and her tongue cut off.
In the spring of 1945, as part of the Ukrainian insurgent army's Moroz squad, Simchich took part in an attack on activists in the village of Lyucha in the Kosov region, as a result of which 6 people were killed. Simchich also participated in the abduction of the first Komsomol member of the village, 15-year-old Stefanko Maria Stepanovna, who was later found murdered in the neighbouring village of Babinopoli. The bandits hanged her, cutting off her breasts, ears, tongue and burned an image of the Komsomol badge on her forehead.
Some gruesome details right there. And it wasn't just Zelensky who honored these nationalist figures, including Miroslav Simchich, but also other Ukrainian presidents. Viktor Yushchenko awarded Miroslav Simchich a state medal in 2005, and a monument was erected for him in 2008. And in 2015, Pyotr Poroshenko decided to present him with the Order of Freedom Award. So really, after all of this evidence and after all of these cases, no wonder people are raising their eyebrows as to what Laura Loomer is doing in Ukraine. And it brings us back to the original question: what's changed for Laura Loomer?
That's great reporting. That is America Now for now. I'm Ben Swann. For more stories, visit our website, rt.com, and join us every night at 7, 8, 9, and 10 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for watching. Have a great night. And remember, question everything.